Dire situation developing in Mississippi's largest city, Jackson, as residents there already dealing with record-setting rain, flooded streets, now left without running water.
So Mississippi's Governor Tate Reeves has now declared a state of emergency for the city after its main water treatment facility failed yesterday. That has left thousands without enough water to even flush the toilets or fight fires.
This is a very different situation from a boil water notice, which is also a serious situation which residents of Jackson have become tragically numb to. Until it is fixed, it means we do not have reliable running water.
The water is not safe to drink, and I would even say it's not safe to brush your teeth with because we are not seeing adequate chlorination and inability to consistently disinfect the water.
Right now, the city of Jackson, Mississippi is going through what is unfortunately an avoidable catastrophe, and really avoidable on two fronts. First and foremost, we have been failing to do basically anything about climate change, specifically in terms of doing anything to reduce carbon emissions, but additionally in terms of actually responding to the threats that are coming from climate change, which is the other part of the failure. Jackson, Mississippi has been having issues with their water for some time now. They've actually recently had a lot of boil water advisories, meaning that fundamentally the city just isn't getting clean enough water that you would expect to have in a modern country in the year 2022. But so why exactly is this? Well, it's part of a larger trend that is happening across the United States of America, which is basically the categorical disinvestment from critical infrastructure and the things that are necessary to make modern life possible. You know, like updating the electrical grids, which they aren't doing in Texas, or maintaining bridges and dams and roads and water treatment plants like they're doing basically everywhere in the United States. We've almost entirely ignored infrastructure in the United States, and there's a couple of different reasons for it. A lot of the times it's because of privatization. There's actually a lot of infrastructure in the United States that was publicly funded, that was literally built by the government with government employees or through government contract, but then later, for one reason or another, it ended up getting privatized. And when you privatize a lot of this critical infrastructure, the companies try and figure out how to save money. I mean, the whole sell to the public is that it's going to be cheaper, that it's going to be more efficient. Except for when they say cheaper and more efficient, they mean cheaper for them and they mean more profitable for them as well. Because very often when critical infrastructure gets privatized, usually user fees are increased. But then those private companies, very often, in order to make even more money, tend to cut the budget for maintenance and repairs. And that is actually what happened when a dam collapsed in Michigan just a couple of years ago, where it was publicly funded and publicly created, was then later privatized, where the private industry decided not to do the regular maintenance that they were supposed to. But another reason why we have ridiculous schemes like this across the United States is because the federal government basically has been ignoring its duty to actually fund this infrastructure, and state governments have been ignoring their duty to fund this infrastructure. So these private investors can come in and say, hey, look at us. We can swoop in and take up this infrastructure and we'll take care of it. Don't worry about it. I mean, just remember the fiasco that happened in California with the electric grid there a few years ago. This is something that is happening across the country. The desire to reap efficiency from the private market has actually led to our infrastructure basically losing the funding that it needs. And whenever funding actually does get put into it, that funding is usually just taken in as profits by the private enterprise, because heaven forbid the government actually step in and reclaim ownership over the critical infrastructure that we all depend on. But here's why it's important. If you look at the water treatment plant in Jackson, it's pretty clear that maintenance has been needed for a fairly long time. Except, of course, our government doesn't really care. And because our government doesn't really care, nothing really gets done about it. And people live under boil water advisories until all of a sudden a flood that isn't even a record-breaking flood leads to one of the pumps failing and leaves an entire city of people without water, where now the National Guard is having to be called in to supply folks with clean water. And the worst part about this is this is going to become more likely for two reasons. One, because climate change is going to make these disasters happen a heck of a lot more frequently. And two, because the chronic underfunding is reaching a critical point where now infrastructure all over the country is reaching its breaking point. And the idea of investing actual money into infrastructure as opposed to private industry is responded to by Republicans as though it's some sort of like evil plot to take over the world instead of, just like basic necessary infrastructure upgrades. And then we always hear about inflation, inflation, inflation. Somehow, apparently, developing infrastructure will cause massive inflation, but PPP loans, well, that's just no big deal. We can do that all day long without inflation. And so this mentality has put us in this terrible situation. Except, if Hurricane Katrina is any lesson, whenever terrible situations like this happen and disasters come in, usually you have a whole group of private lobbyists that come in suggesting even more privatization to solve the problem. And I'm gonna go out and make a wild guess that that's probably happening in Jackson, Mississippi right now. There's probably somebody somewhere from some think tank showing up to talk about how the solution to the problem that they're dealing with is going to have to involve some sort of private investment. Because under capitalism, the only thing that really matters is making a profit, no matter how shameless that is. So all that is to say, the unfortunate reality is that this was fundamentally avoidable, and that there's going to be a lot more situations like this across the country, and they will also be avoidable. If we want to prevent disasters like this from happening in our communities, what we need to do is reduce our fossil fuel consumption and actually do something about preventing climate change, and we actually need to put in place contingency plans where we have backup systems and fully maintained infrastructure to make sure that as climate change puts stress on our infrastructure, that it's not breaking it. Because at our current trajectory, this type of thing is going to be a lot more common.